On June 28, 1914, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, Austria and Germany declared war on France. Britain declared war on the Germans after they drove through neutral Belgium. Suddenly, all Europe was at war. Within 1 month of fighting, casualties reached a staggering 1 million people.
The war had not been going on very long before people began to realize that we have been swindled and misled. That this is not going to be some glorious, dramatic event that is going to solve all the problems of political and territorial that we've been looking at. That it is not necessarily their fault. We're not going to win this in a few months and solve all our problems. It is going to be gruesome. It is already gruesome, bloody, and seemingly without end.
The United States and Switzerland remained neutral, but Switzerland, because of its proximity, was by far the favorite destination for those fleeing the conflict. And the German-speaking city of Zurich was where most of those people gathered. Indeed, one could find living among the expatriates Hermann Hesse, James Joyce, and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, quietly laying the groundwork for his revolution. Lenin lived at number 14 Spiegelgasse, and only a half a block away at number 1 Spiegelgasse, two German refugees trying to cobble together a living as best they could proposed to open a cabaret. Their names were Hugo and Emmy Hennings. They scratched out a living as entertainers. She sang and danced, he played piano. They had convinced the owner of the Mairie Café to let them rent a vacant room in the back, promising him an increase in the sale of beer and sausages. They named it the Cabaret Voltaire, after the 18th century French Enlightenment philosopher and author of Candide. Voltaire was chosen partly because of the values he represented, and partly because his name would help avoid any overly Germanic associations with the club. On the evening of February 5th, 1916, just 2 weeks before the Germans launched their offensive at Verdun, the Cabaret Voltaire was born. Ball wrote of the opening night in his diary.
The place was full to bursting. Many could not get in. About 6 in the evening, when we were still busy hammering and putting up futurist posters, there appeared an oriental-looking deputation of 4 little men, with portfolios and pictures under their arms, bowing politely many times. They introduced themselves, and we came to an understanding without many words.
This Oriental or Eastern-looking deputation included the 19-year-old Romanian poet Sami Rosenstock, better known by his nom de guerre, Tristan Tzara, the man from nowhere. Also from Romania was Marcel Iancu, a quiet architecture student and painter. He would make masks and costumes for their performances. Jean or Hans Arp, depending whether you speak French or German, the 29-year-old Alsatian painter who was already a well-known artist in both France and Germany. Sophie Teuber, a dancer, painter, and choreographer who taught at the nearby Laban School of Dance. 3 weeks later, they were joined by Richard Holzenbeck, thus completing the troupe. Holzenbeck was a medical student and friend of Ball's from before the war. With her sultry voice and commanding stage presence, Emmy Hennings was the star attraction.
Where are the boys who used to hang around me? You used to see them anywhere you found me.
The first performances were essentially a standard variety show with songs, skits, poetry, music, and dancing. Visiting artists, musicians, and dancers dropped by, such as when the pianist Arthur Rubinstein showed up and played Sanson for the crowd.
with the Cabaret Voltaire, they had their own place. And it attracted people, and it attracted a crowd. It was meant to be lively. It was a regular cabaret, as I understand it. It had to compete with other cabarets in the neighborhood. And if the owner, the Dadas didn't own it, if the owner didn't get his money, if people weren't brought in, then they were not going to keep their lease. So it had to be entertaining.
Emboldened by their success, the nightly performances took on a more and more aggressive tone, with the performers often heaping abuse on their patrons. They began to experiment with shock tactics, which oddly enough drew people back for more.
It began slowly, very little laboratory, very effective, very efficient, and of course they were very happy to have this confrontation with the people who were coming, just like in any cabaret. And people were reacting sometimes very enthusiastically, sometimes very aggressively.
Bells, drums, cowbells, blows on the table or on empty boxes all enliven the already wild accents of the new poetic language and excited by purely physical means an audience which had begun by sitting impassively behind its beer mugs. From this state of immobility, it was roused into frenzied involvement with what was going on. This was art, this was life, and this was what they wanted.
We attacked the good Swiss people without any real justification. We attacked everyone in literature, but still I was very much dissatisfied with it. So finally we generalized in such a way that we attacked conventionalism. The bourgeois was one of our main targets. But the bourgeois has been attacked so often that this couldn't satisfy me either. So I found out what is the bourgeois, and I made the sad discovery that we were all bourgeois.
Dada, nom masculin, linguistique. Terme enfantin ou plaisant dont on se sert pour désigner un cheval.
There are really several conflicting stories about the discovery of the word Dada. Probably the most popular one and cited most often has Hugo Ball and Tristan Tzara are concerned about finding a name for one of the dancers at the Cabaret Voltaire. And in order to find this name, they simply inserted a knife into the pages of a Larousse dictionary, or just opened it at random, and put a finger on the page, and the word under that finger was Dada. And they loved that word. It bears some sort of connotation when you hear it of being a little daffy, a little irrational, funny, that you come at it on guard.
Indeed, not only was Dada French for a child's hobby horse, it was a local shampoo product in Zurich, a sacred cow's tail for the Kru tribe in Africa, a wet nurse in certain parts of Italy, a double affirmative, or yes, yes, in Russian, and so much more in so many languages. And yet, nothing linked any of them together, which meant Dada could include nothing and everything in the same breath. As the words stood outside language, so their group stood outside events of the day. And with one stroke, a movement was born. Recognizing the evocative power of sound and inspired by the exotic languages and rhythms of Africa, Tzara and Holzenbeck wrote Chants Nègres, or Negro Chants, a blend of pseudo-Africanese and free association thought. They took the stage accompanied by dancers wearing costumes designed by Marcel Janko. Tzara and Holzenbeck took turns reciting African verse, while the other beat rhythmically on a drum. Hupagandu, Hupachukurabanta buru, Hupaganda buru, Ishamunga buru, The dancers, choreographed by Sophie Teuber, looked anything but graceful, and the African poems sounded like gibberish to the ears of the Zurichers. And by most accounts, they were not amused.
Yes, of course, there was a kind of energy and explosion and real pleasure to play this African side of their personality. But at the same time, they were very aware about the fact they were bringing something outside the Occidental culture, from outside.
In a city of revolutionaries, anarchists, spies, and draft dodgers, it was not the studious Russians who were the most suspect in the eyes of the police. Rather, it was the raucous Dadas, agenda unknown.
We must return to the innermost alchemy of the word. We must even give up the word too, to keep for poetry its last and holiest refuge.
The question of language was absolutely central to Dada because language was perceived as the mother lode of culture. Language guides our behavior. Language determines what we can think and not think and what we can do and not do. It actually affects our perception of the world. Okay, and the ramifications are huge in terms of how you perform the rest of your life in terms of that culture. So to cancel that out cancels out nationalism, it cancels out behavior driven by specific national languages and so on, and establishes what you might call a kind of a common ground from which then you could redefine or re-articulate a language or re-articulate shared language or whatever.
Language in the mind of Hugo Ball had been so misused and so corrupted by politicians and the press that words had ceased to have meaning. His solution was to move away from the meaning of words to the meaning of sounds.
There was a kind of attitude that they could already understand the world as an unity that could be used.
And thus, in an effort to free words from syntax, Ball developed the idea of the Lautgedicht, or sound poem. The high point of Cabaret Voltaire was Hugo Ball's performance on June 23rd of his sound poem, Elephant Caravan. Dressed in a Cubist version of a shaman's or witch doctor's costume, Ball was unable to walk, and so he was escorted with great ceremony onto the stage. It began as a simple performance, a reading, but halfway through the delivery of his so-called nonsense verse, Ball fell under its spell and found himself transported to a wholly unexpected place, in need of a way to return home.
The heavy vowel sequences and the plodding rhythm of the elephants in Elephant Caravan had given me one last crescendo. But how was I to get to the end? Then I noticed that my voice had no choice but to take on the ancient cadence of priestly lamentation. O Gaji, Betty, Bimba, Glandridi, Lauli, Loni, Kadori, Gajama, Bimberi, Glasala, Glandridi Glasala Tufum I Zimbrabim Blasa Galasasa Tufum I Zimbrabim. For a moment, it seemed as if there were a pale, bewildered face in my Cubist mask, that half frightened, half curious face of a 10-year-old boy, trembling and hanging avidly on the priest's words in the requiems and high masses in his home parish. Then the lights went out, as I had ordered, and bathed in sweat, I was carried down off the stage like a magical bishop.
Just 6 months after opening, the Cabaret Voltaire closed due to a combination of the nightly excesses of the cabaret crowds and the fact that the Dadas were rather lax in their collection of cover charges and failed to make rent.